Okay, in this segment, we're going to talk about Sadat's policies after the 1973 war. And in many ways, Sadat produced three major changes compared to Nasser, so I want to talk a little bit about those. The first was a shift in alliance from the former Soviet Union to the United States. If you recall, earlier I keep mentioning that Sadat keep making all kinds of overtures toward us to be joining our side, and we really never got the message, or we simply ignored him. After 1973 war, we finally accepted him on our side, and Kissinger worked feverishly to work out the eventual evacuation of the Israelis from the Sinai, and then working out a peace agreement between the two, Egypt and Israel. So the biggest shift with Sadat's policy was a shift in alliance pattern, and he's coming to our side from the Soviet Union. So really the Soviet Union is, if you think in terms of Cold War, has lost its most important client in the Middle East, and that would be Egypt. The second shift was the shift in the elite alliance pattern that he relied on. If you remember when we discussed Nasser, Nasser's elite base were really consisted of two elements. One was the military, the critical element of it, and then the other was technocratic. We refer to that alliance pattern as a bootstrap strategy, and the idea was that these people, the technocrats and the military, are well organized, and they will be able to pull out Egypt from backwardness. In the case of Sadat, he changed that pattern by bringing in an additional element. So besides the military and the technocratic element, he added the bourgeoisie. So in other words, he tried to build a base for himself among the so-called middle class, the bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie in Egypt. And this was accompanied by a kind of a more laissez-faire type of economic system, in which he would give far greater freedom in economic decision to individuals. Again, it's economic freedom. I'm not talking about in any way political freedom. The program that he called Infitah, means opening, was essentially a kind of a liberalization of the economy, giving quite a bit of decisional freedom to various elements, especially the urban part in Cairo and other big cities, giving them freedom to engage in business. Nasser had a kind of an Arab socialist streak that was completely removed by Sadat and his policy. So the Infitah in the process made Egypt much more corrupt under Sadat. Sadat's family members and many of the elite's relatives and in-laws began getting government jobs and the lion's share of public and private mega contracts. So Infitah really became a gateway to what is oftentimes referred to, and this was the situation in Iran, by the way, crony capitalism. So in many ways, under Sadat, Egypt was almost approximating the kind of a path that Iran had been traveling under the Shah. And this is an important point, because later on you will see that there is a very important connection between the Shah and Shah's policies, both domestic and foreign, and Sadat's policy. So you have the parvenus, the newly rich, who are enamored by these change, and they love Sadat and they're very happy with him. So these bourgeoisie, these parvenus, the newly rich, really never liked Nasser nor his policy because, as I said, Nasser's mass base of support was the poor and the military and the nationalists. So with this change in policy, Sadat is really building a new base of support which was ignored by Nasser, but certainly he is cultivating it. Sadat is cultivating it. And the third major shift of the three shifts I mentioned, the last one was a shift away from a focus on Arab nationalism and in its place embrace of Egyptian nationalism. Again, you can surmise or predict such a change when you compare the profile of Sadat with that of Nasser. Both of those individuals, Nasser and Sadat, both of them were deeply attached to Egypt and primarily attached to Egypt. But Sadat had almost little or no attachment to the Arabs. He consistently saw himself as Egyptian, and Arab didn't mean much. Whereas for Nasser, Arab was very, very important, just below in terms of attachment intensity, below Egyptian identity. And then you will see later why this point about a shift from Arab nationalism to Egyptian nationalism is going to be profoundly important in the kind of a settlement that Sadat is going to reach with Israel in 1978 with the Camp David peace accord. So these three major shifts really capture the essence of the changes that were instantiated by Sadat after the 1973 war. And in a sense, the 1973 war gave him a license to be his own person rather than follow Nasser's path. And he is following a very, very different path than Nasser did. Now, as I always do in the countries that I discuss, one quick way for us to get a sense of the way Sadat ruled and of course Nasser ruled is to use the control system that we have discussed throughout this course. So what I'd like to do is to start with the control system and do the comparison between Nasser's last year versus Sadat. So let's look at Nasser's control system. At the primary level, the highest level, I put C, or coercion. Coercion under Nasser, remember he was a dictator, is directed mostly against the liberal intellectuals and the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie was really not treated well under Nasser. Again, his focus was some kind of an Arab socialism, which wasn't well defined under Nasser. He wasn't really a theoretician. So coercion is at the highest level. Below that, however, is what we call normative active. Remember, that refers to the ability of the government or the ruler to be able to excite the masses. And the reason I put that at the primary level, although certainly below coercion, is that it reflects Nasser's charismatic quality. And in that sense, he was able to really excite the masses both in Egypt and abroad among the Arab population and even in the third world. The liberals liked the nationalism part, but they did not like the dictatorship. So this combination is very important, and you will see that this is the kind of a combination you get from charismatic leaders that are authoritarian. Also, NA at that level indicates that the Pan-Arabists and the lower middle class and the poor, people who really formed Nasser's mass base of support, were excited and were willing to follow Nasser's leadership. At the secondary level, I would put utilitarian, and I've put it lower, a little bit lower than the normal place it is, which is right on the secondary point, because of demographic pressures in Egypt's and Egypt's economy poses perennial challenge to whoever is running the country. Therefore, unless they get help, it's difficult for Egypt to satisfy the utilitarian needs, the basic needs of its population. And then finally, I place beneath the U, I place normative habitual. It's placed at low secondary because people by now are beginning to accept the system, and in a sense they're becoming habituated to Nasser's rule. So now let's look at Sadat's control system, and in this case, before I show you this slide, I want to point out that I'm going to be presenting a diachronic graph. That is, I'm going to graph it over several points, not just a kind of a still picture at a given point in time. So let me go to that slide. And I start with 1971 when Sadat becomes succeeds Nasser. And the one that I really want to focus on is 1973, in the immediate aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, the October War. Notice what has happened to coercion. The coercion is steadily going down to the secondary level. Remember, if it goes to the tertiary, you have it's a democratic system. It means coercion is purely for the purposes of law enforcement. But at the secondary level, it means that it's still significant amount of coercion being used to achieve compliance. But at the B level means that he really doesn't need to do it. He doesn't need to coerce, because after 1973 war, Sadat has become popular. And notice what also happens to NA. NA also moves to the top level because of the excitement that was generated by Egyptian performance. There is a sense of pride to being an Egyptian, to being an Arab in the aftermath of the 1973 war. The crossing of the canal almost universally was regarded as, quote unquote, an Arab victory. This despite the fact that at the end of the war, the Israeli forces had really defeated the Egyptian. But the fact that no one thought that they could even cross the canal, and they were able to do so, that was the real focus of that war. Also, in the case of Sadat, utilitarian begins to go up a little bit as the economy improves. Finally, normative habitual also goes slightly up because masses are beginning to embrace and accept Sadat's leadership. And now here's the puzzle for you. The end of 1973 war was a moment that Sadat could have made a bid to be as important or even more important than Nasser. He was in a position, because of the performance of the Egyptian in that war, he was in a position to actually coerce the Arab world into unity. Syrians were joining it, maybe Saudi Arabia, but certainly Jordan would have. He had shown the world that Arabs had the ability to fight. So the defeat of 1973 had actually enhanced Sadat's popularity because of the superb performance of his army. Also, Egyptians had defeated Israel in a major tank battle, something that nobody thought they'd be able to do. Interesting part about that war was that General Sharon, because of his insubordination of Israeli military strategy and his decision not to follow order, he ended up actually encircling Egypt's Third Army, which really helped Israeli to be able to claim some victory out of the jaws of defeat. So it was General Sharon's insubordination that helped Israel because he decided that strategy was not going to work. All of this, therefore, makes the mystery of Sadat giving up all of his bargaining leverage even more astonishing. After the 1973 war, he moved steadily in the direction of giving up all the bargaining strength that he had accomplished by that war. And just when the Soviet Union had begun to respect him, had begun to treat him like a valuable ally, willing to provide him with lots and lots of arms, he begins to move away from them and toward us. And remember, we are seen as the proto-imperial power by the Arab world. And the astonishing part was he did this without extracting any price from us for making the strategic switch. Remember, we got the Cold War going, and Egypt is the most important Arab state. Suddenly, the leader of that state is willing to switch side. What a defeat that would be for the Soviet, our Cold War enemy. The truth was, we probably were willing to pay through the nose to get him to our side. So now you ask yourself, what was the logic for him doing that?